This next panel and this next segment of the day opens up our gaze onto the world, keeping as the center of gravity the focus on systems, on prototypes, on the interconnectedness, not only of crisis, but also of actions that we can start to actually tackle this crisis. I would like to introduce this panel, Designed by Systems. It's a really interesting panel that is composed of different proficiencies and different expertise. We have Wong Mun Summ, who is one of the founding partners of WOHA, a company, an architectural company that is very dear and very known to all of you. They founded it in 1994 here in Singapore. And what they try to do through their projects is to insert active components that participate in larger urban and natural systems. I have picked from the biographies what was convenient for me. So it's really, so that I can make the point. Second will come Emi Kiyota. Emi Kiyota is beautiful, an environmental gerontologist, which means somebody that is trying to really think of the aging population, that is all of us, because we're all aging, and try to really make sure that their experience is our experience, and that there is an integration in the territory of all ages, because the aging population is growing. Now, that's something that also the other designers and architects in the panel do, so it's going to be interesting to see how everybody tackles it differently. Stephen Cairns is a designer, an author, an educator, and even in his case, beautiful area of expertise, agropolitan territories, the integration of urban and rural, and actually more than the integration, also the co-participation and the co-design that the two fields can have. And then last but not least, Nirmal Kishnani, who is an expert of sustainability, projects and policies in Asia, and who works with many different agencies, besides also teaching on these particular subjects. So I would like to call on stage first Mun Summ, please. Oh, here you are. Thank you. Welcome. Woo-hoo! See, everybody loves you. You're a rock star too.
Good afternoon. This short talk is about form follow systems. Part one is about building scale, 2 projects as prototypes with system thinking approach, and part 2 will be done by Nirmal. We'll talk about impact of scaling up to neighborhoods and districts as part of our research by design in our integrated sustainable design master studio at NUS. Skyview at Dawson is a 50-story public housing project. It is about densification, high rise, high density, high amenity, but also about human scale, focusing on community. Planned 3-dimensionally with a matrix of sky villages and multiple ground levels. On the right, through a series of pictorial, you see how the sky villages are organized. On the real ground level, mature trees are kept as a park. 80 homes, 10 stories, make one sky village. Diamond shape in plan, apartments 1 unit thick, 3 sky villages are connected side by side. Another layer of sky villages is stacked on. The open courtyard of the diamond plan enables a vertical breezeway, which makes it possible to have a vertical hot air movement and effecting good cross-ventilation to all apartments. Yet another layer of sky villages are stacked on. Every row of sky villages is connected and making it possible to have a 200-meter-long sky park, resulting in many different paths you can take to visit your neighbors without ever coming down back to the ground. The fourth and final layer, in theory, we can keep stacking sky villages and increase density. On the left is a real photograph of the layering of sky parks. On the left is again another image of a photograph of the village green of one of the sky villages. And you can see and hear when you walk home through this linkways to the apartments. On the right is a short section of the building. Overall, 960 homes, 12 sky villages, a park on the ground level with a neighborhood square, 4 tiers of sky parks, all accessible to the public at all times, including the topmost, which we call it the penthouse park for the people. Topping the building is a solar canopy harvesting enough clean energy to power all the public amenities. Post-occupation surveys conducted highlighted some interesting findings that validated some of these strategies. 18% of savings in energy bills due to the good cross-ventilation, 3.5 times more visitors is counted in the sky parks, and 1.3 times number of neighbors considered as friends. The second project is Kampong Admiralty. It is another public housing development, but for the elderly with mixed uses. The focus is on the elderly within the community and being biocentric. It is located centrally in the neighborhood center and connects to the MRT, making it convenient for the elderly to access all parts of Singapore. You can see the MRT on the right and the building stepping up as a park, shielding against the noise from the MRT. We took a club sandwich approach, putting together synergistic outcomes. First and second level are the covered plaza and the community living room and hawker center as the community dining room. Level 3 to 5, we located the medical center and the first units of elderly housing. From level 5 to 8 is an elevated and stepping park, and within are daycare facilities and amenities for the young and old. On the very top, a community park, a community farm to encourage active and healthy lifestyle. The stepping and cascading landscape show us an important implement a vertical phyto remediation and detention of rainwater, at the same time creating waterfalls and bodies for an enjoyment of the users. What is interesting is that when we conducted a biodiversity survey, we realized that as compared to a park on the ground level, even as a building, Kampong Admiralty has 17 animal species more compared to the park next door. And in terms of the ecosystem services, what is also interesting is that the landscaping and the development, even though the building is occupying almost full site coverage, provides about 20% of the ecosystem services as compared to a lowland rainforest, regulating air quality, water runoff, and reducing solar heat reduction. It is hard to describe Kampong Admiralty in totality, but maybe a short video will do a better job.
Thank you, Mun Summ. Now let me welcome to the stage Emi Kiyota.
Older adults are increasingly being marginalized around the world, even as their numbers are growing rapidly. For too often, aging is viewed simply as a process of decline, the growth that accompanies aging invisible to society. As a result, elders are effectively cut off from the flow of daily life with us. Their wisdom and perspective lost to the children and younger adults in their community. 12 years ago, I have found a ibasho, which is a principle-based approach, developed to challenge the prevalent, mostly negative perception about aging by empowering elders to co-create physical place where they can contribute to community members for all ages rather than being taken care of. So this is pictures that came from a project. One is from Japan and Nepal and Philippines. When I give a lecture, sometimes people are surprised that I don't have a very sad older person's pictures. Because this, to me, it is a question I try to ask. What does good living in older age mean to you? There are lots of othering happening in our society. Older people are them. Person with dementia are someone else. But aging is something that none of humankind actually avoided. We all going to face it. Are you happy with nursing home? Are you happy with assisted living? Are you happy with adult day center? If you're not, waiting around does not change anything. So what can we do? So this slide actually captures what we want to do through ibasho, and it's not only ibasho, but I would like to imagine. This one, it says, the time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make other people happy. I found this quote in elementary school in Bhutan, actually, when I was working on senior housing project for Bhutanese monks, which I didn't think that they were going to retire. But there is a retirement age in Bhutan for monks. This quote actually very much resonated with me because it captured the gap between our current approach of care, which is to look after older people as if they are social liabilities. Everybody wants to be, and also the gap between the current approach of care and what elders and we want when we get older. Everyone wants to be useful to others, regardless of their age, physical, and cognitive abilities. It really resonates to me, this one. And however, the current system treats elders as a people for whom we have to care rather than treating them as the people who can actually contribute to our community and teach us something. So ibasho approach recognizes elders as a valuable asset to their community, empowering them to be change agents who challenge the social perception and change the narrative from negative to positive. So I actually wrote down this little comment when I went on that diary that when I saw this. How can each of us be a part of co-designing shared future for elders across the globe, in which aging is not something to fear, but an opportunity to appreciate potential within us all for meaningful growth throughout our lives. So this is ibasho's pictures that I worked with in Japan. This is a reality of modern society. Older people exercising, children sitting in the bench and playing video games. But its important message here is that our social policy has not been rewritten to adapt these issues because we still try to protect older person from younger generation, but older people are different. So what can we do to change it? So these are the 8 principles that we came up with. This is a principle base so that it can be applied to other places. It's very simple. It's just repetitive. It's kind of repeated common sense, but sometimes common sense has to be repeated. So principle 1 is elder wisdom. You know, older people are valuable asset. Principle 2, no one wants to go to institution, but the normal place like coffee shop. And principle 3, demarginalization. All residents participate. You don't want to be in the middle of nowhere with a green space. We want to be in where the action is. And community ownership. You know, older people can actually own this and run it. And the principle number 5, older people don't want to be around other older people all the time. And it has to be culturally appropriate. That laughing means that you probably agree on this, right? And principle 7 is that, you know, just community has to be environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable so that programs sustain within their hands. The last one is embracing imperfection. In Japanese, we call it wabi-sabi. The real beauty lie in the imperfections. You know, if we just try to wait until perfect moment, that doesn't happen. Why don't we just try doing something, improve it from there? That's where the beauty lies. So what makes Ibasho? It's just basically try to adapt the 8 principle, and those activities shouldn't be to look after older people. And the place should be designed by the older people and then keep changing. So opening day is not the last day of the change. Elders are keep changing, and the process has to be really elderly led, and really elders has to take a leadership to tell us what they want to do. So these are the places that we created. This is in Japan. 3 places that I worked with happened to be post-disaster area. So this is in Philippines. This is Nepal. So now I'm involved in the health district project in Queenstown. So what we try to do is to have really bring a co-chair of 3 agencies to bring the wellness rather than healthcare focus. So I just wanted to bring all this 2 slides up because it is just to say just integration of agency is important. But I like to live with design implication based on my 30 years of design experience. If we just try to design the building that protect elders, that might create dependency if we're not careful. And if we try to provide special service for elders, that might create the ageism. Specially designed service and built environment may create stigma. Age-specific design creates segregation. Excessive convenient technology might create social isolation. I really like to leave this question for you, how we can design with older people to be able to create the space where we want to age. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you, Amy. That was really, really important. And now on the stage, Stephen Cairns.
Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Stephen Cairns, and I'd like to bring together 3 main themes in my talk. I'd like to think about food systems, I'd like to think about food waste, and I'd like to think about how black soldier flies, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, can help us in upcycling that food waste. And finally, I'd like to think about those 3 themes, specifically what it means to be in the city. Designing food future systems. We probably know this already. This is a very significant theme for sustainable cities worldwide, but it has practical relevance right here in Singapore because the Singapore Food Agency has adopted an ambitious and very impressive policy to produce 30% of Singapore's nutritional needs by 2030 domestically. And for those of you who know this field, that statistic is going from a base of around about 0% currently. Most of Singapore's food, as you know, is already imported. So to move from that very low number up to 30% by 2030 is a serious ambition. You might also see from that title that most of the focus of that policy ambition will be on the production of food. So it's bringing production of food into the city. Already super interesting and super complicated question. And we've seen examples of that, how that's already been achieved and experimented with. However, if you think about the second statistic, that 40% of total world food production is currently wasted, then there's another dimension that we have to think alongside production. And of course, this is the management of food waste. And they go very, very close together, hand in hand. A couple of footnotes here. The wealthier the city, the higher the food waste. So I suspect 40% is relatively conservative for cities like Singapore. So my main hypothesis here that future food systems need tighter circularity to achieve and support the aims of the Singapore Food Agency, and of course, to support the aims of the Sustainable Development Goals and all the other kind of global and regional policy frameworks that we're very familiar with. Let me change tack a little bit here. Let's imagine one of the nastiest, one of the most generic pieces of food that we probably consume guiltily, and this is the hamburger. The hamburger is highly processed food, and let's think about it entering the food system. Of course, the wheat has to be harvested to produce the bread. The meat has to be harvested to produce the filling. There are typically gherkins, there are onions in there as well. There are sesame seeds perhaps on top of the bun. And of course, there are sugars and salts and all kinds of preservatives kind of mixed into that. So in this simple diagram of a food system, you can imagine the assembly of the bun in the production process, the production phase, the processing, very sophisticated logistical system to bring that hamburger to your table, whether it's at a restaurant or delivered to you at your door, and of course the consumption process that happens in that. Now that 40% figure that I mentioned earlier, you can see peeling off that process. So there's waste at every point along the way, but I draw your attention to the human utilization. The point of consumption is where most of that waste happens, whether it's the restaurant, the hawker center, or your home. So this tighter circularity is really significant kind of concept. This is, of course, the aspiration, is how do we close that loop, how to produce that tighter circularity. And what we're interested in is how we can, in a way, reduce that 40%, but also bring most of that 40% back into one or other of those phases in that food system. A couple of other things to mention while this diagram is up. I said this is very significant for the city, and this is another kind of diversionary footnote. In this kind of system diagram, most of this process is happening outside of the city. The production, maybe the distribution is into the city, and certainly the waste. The city is really primarily, historically and conventionally a space of consumption. And of course now that's changing because we're thinking about production, manufacturing as well as food back into the city. So most of that's outside of the city, and this is also historically outside of the city, and the reasons are obvious. When food breaks down, it's smelly, it rots, it falls apart, it's unsightly, and we, in a way, we stigmatize that aspect of the food production. So we're very serious about trying to get hold of all of these points in the compass and bringing them back to the city and think what it means to reintegrate those processes into the city. Now let me introduce you to the hero of my story. This is the black soldier fly. The black soldier fly, I think you'll be pleased to know, is endemic to Singapore, endemic to tropical regions, but doesn't typically interact with human life. So you probably don't see these around your home, but they're part of the kind of fabric, the ecosystem of Singapore. And they're very important because, especially the larvae, you'll see in a moment, voraciously consumes human food and is a really important agent of bioconversion, and therefore becomes a very important design agent in this story of the food system design. So let's go back to our hamburger. Remember, I introduced it at the beginning as one point of entry into this, and I'm going to give you a little snapshot of black soldier flies larvae. This is the real hero of the story, of course, en masse. As you can see, they're pulling apart this imaginary hamburger. I know you've probably had your tea and dinner is very far away, so you can, the organizers have politely slotted me in the middle here. But you can see the wheat is being pulled apart, the bun is being pulled apart, the gherkins are gradually going to dissolve. Eventually the meat also gets consumed in this process as well. This is a 48-hour period. I won't subject you to all of it, but I think you get the gist. But the really important thing here is that larvae themselves are already part of a food system. They're already being consumed by chickens and fish naturally. So to leverage on that process and to reintegrate them, they also become a very important part of that closing of that loop. And of course, the casings, or to be more discreet about it, the excrement of these larvae are also nutrient rich and produces a very, very important part of the fertilizers. Those are three different practical ways in which the black soldier fly can help close that loop, the bottom edge of that diagram. Okay, something perhaps a little bit more familiar to you. As I'm an urban designer and I'm working with a number of colleagues, and we would like to think quite practically, what do you do with that? What do you do with that process in the city, given that we know theoretically it's very, very important and very, very valuable and directly relevant to the policy aims of the Singapore Food Agency? So the first thing we'd like to do is to think about the conventional model. This is on the edge of town. This is the massified condition on the edge of town. Very effective, already being done, but probably most conservative. The second, what if we brought those black soldier flies to hawker centre sites of existing production, existing consumption of food? This is a super interesting possibility, I think. And then finally, what would happen if we distributed the black soldier flies facilities to sites where food will be consumed on occasion, special events, special sites, for example, through the life cycle, the seasonality of the city, for example. So these are three different models that we're working on. And just to conclude, you've seen some of the slides from Emi about the incredible number of institutions and people that have to come together to make these things work. I'm not going to name everybody here, but I want you just to catch the institutions. I want to flag especially Professor Nalini Purniyamurthy, who is a biological scientist. She specializes in black soldier fly reproduction. And I'm especially proud that she connected with me, and as a designer, I've been invited into the special circle of scientists. I'm very proud of that. And just on your left, you'll see insect engineering, environmental impact, food safety, nutrition, industries, of course, communities, and then a whole range of other kind of industrial design processes alongside urban design. And I'd be really excited to talk to you more about our experiences about that process. But in the meantime, don't forget the soldier fly. Don't forget the soldier fly as an agent of design in the city. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Hooray for the soldier flies. Thank you, Stephen. And now Nirmal Kishnani.
Thank you, Paula. Very happy to be here. I'm going to pick up very quickly from where Mun Summ left off. He talked about systems thinking and 3D planning at the building scale. I'm going to talk about that speculatively at the urban scale. Mun Summ and I are co-program directors of the MSc program in NUS. The focus in the program is design research. We explore better structures of relationships wherein many systems, energy, water, mobility, operating at multiple scales, function together in a mutualistic manner. The research looks at systems thinking in the context of Singapore, where it's applied to land use and planning. So we ask, what do words like resilience mean? What is the role of architectural form and urban form? I'm going to illustrate this with the Sungai Kadut Industrial Estate, which is an aging estate to the north of Singapore. This study was sponsored by JDC Corporation. So the questions that we asked relate to densification and land use, integration of new industrial processes and business models, but also how to facilitate circularity, a topic that's come up more than once today. So we start at the scale of the building, the vertical stratification of programs and systems, what Mun Summ called 3D planning. Here is a typological exploration, not unlike Kampung Admiralty, only maybe bigger. What if we extend the 3D logic to clusters of such buildings? Well, several things start to happen. We see new urban connections on the ground, below ground, above ground. We can also aggregate productive surfaces for food farms and solar canopies. And when typologies jump scale, when many buildings connect to form urban networks, we see the emergence of new forms at the urban scale. This idea of stratified connectivity is certainly not new. We see it in cities like Hong Kong and Tokyo, which have evolved over time, often organically. The question here is then, what value can we extract that relates to circularity and resilience? Land scarcity is very much part of the narrative in Singapore. But what if planning were more multifunctional and multi-systemic? Interestingly, mobility becomes a key to this question. Seen here is the linking of horizontal lines and the vertical, such as lifts and mover systems. Urban form begins to look like a 3D matrix, the segregation and intersection of vehicular, logistical, and pedestrian pathways. Here, the ground is freed up as a contiguous public and ecological space. The Sungai Kadut Master Plan was, of course, guided by a wider land use strategy. But in this union of form and program, we had discussions on circularity because resource flows, much like mobility, must operate at different scales. I will illustrate this very quickly with one system. At the building scale, water is detained and recycled. These processes deploy both equipment and landscapes. To manage deficits and excess, the building is connected to the neighborhood or to the master plan. At the neighborhood scale, we discover new economies of scale. Grey water treatment, for instance, makes more sense here than at the building scale. At the master plan scale, we have even larger features and elements, such as water reclamation plants. Interestingly, these can now integrate with natural systems, such as reservoirs, wetlands, and mangroves. What we're seeing here is the emergence of polycentric hybrid networks, wherein production and consumption are close to each other, and nature is co-opted. Polycentric networks are, by definition, more resilient, better than monocentric systems, when water, for example, is channeled to several large treatment plants in the monocentric systems that we have in Singapore, for instance, the city becomes more vulnerable to disruption. So this underlying principle of polycentric and circular flows can then be applied to other resources. These nodes and pathways are integrated into the urban form. Some elements happen at the neighborhood scale, others at the master plan scale. Singapore's view of urban nature, after many decades of being a garden city, is very anthropocentric at heart. We plant trees because they make us feel better. They make our cities more livable. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se. In fact, one could add to this ecosystem services wherein nature is harnessed to make cities function better at little or no cost. Now, Sungai Kadut, for example, sits at the crossroads of very important natural areas which have been fragmented over time. There is already an ecosystem canvas here. When the conversation shifts to the question of repair and regeneration in Singapore, it must confront the land scarcity question. How will we pay for this? Here is a comparison of ecosystem services that this landscape produces: water runoff, air quality, solar heat reduction, all with the help of blue-green systems. The proposed master plan is significantly better than the existing condition. Also, it anticipates the effects of global warming, such as extreme heat and rain. So why wouldn't we want to work in an industrial area that looks and behaves like a natural ecosystem? Why not a waterfront park next to an agri-tech district? This idea of win-win planning has been tested in our studios in various locations across Singapore. Here is a proposal for a retrofit for Jurong Gateway. We are finding here, as in many other areas that we've studied, that a district can easily achieve autonomy in water, can be pushed to produce at least 50% energy that it needs, and grow more than 100% of all leafy vegetables. In the process, interestingly, both public space and green cover more than double. So that, of course, leaves us with the question, why aren't we simply doing this? And that perhaps could be a question in the panel discussion. But we have a book out that summarizes the work that we've done with these studios, the Sungai Kadut study specifically, in which these topics are addressed. Form Intelligence, if anyone's interested, can be downloaded from our website. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nirmal. Perfect time. Thank you. And I would like to call back on stage, please, Mun Summ and Stephen and Emi. Thank you for these amazing presentations. We already have so many of the questions coming from the audience. Please remember, pour your own water. Yes. And I will start with one question that might go mostly to Stephen and to Nirmal, so about agropolitan and integration of those systems, but actually it's for everyone. Does the density that is so natural to Singapore help accelerate progress? Does it make you face these issues faster than the rest of the world? Issues of food scarcity, issue of integration of different generation? Mm-hmm. Is it fluid dynamics that the compression here makes everything go faster?
The density, I mean, of course, Singapore is invested, as we heard this morning, Singapore is invested in density for a whole range of different reasons. But if you take the perspective of density from an economic perspective, there's strong evidence to say that high density is closely correlated with economic productivity. There are all kinds of environmental benefits that follow from that. So these are all theoretically well-established principles. The big complicated question are the ones that Nirmal and Mun Summ are addressing, is how to do it well and how to do it in a way that retains the qualities of a much simpler kind of maybe suburban kind of city. And for me, as a theorist, I now hand over to the architects because they're grappling with exactly that question. And the question of food, of course, I'm happy to come back to because I think is one of the interesting elements of that story.
So one of the assumptions of urban planning is that density equals a loss of livability. That as quality of life, of livability, urban livability. And that and then somehow these two things are at odds. I think just to draw upon the project Mun Summ showed earlier, Skyville, that you can think about density in new ways that allows the scale of that environment to be addressed, the human-centric scale of that environment to be dealt with. In the Sungai Kadut master plan, the density offered the option to add multiple layers to create a kind of a synergy of parts that would not perhaps otherwise have existed. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a full, but there are, I mean, obviously limits to density. You can cross a line in density where environments become too crowded and overwhelming. What is the sweet spot of density? I think that is the big question a lot of urban planners are grappling with, because currently we have numbers, the average city, Singapore, for example, maybe 20,000, 30,000 peak density. And how high can it go before you cross that threshold where it becomes too much?
Interesting. It's almost like the uncanny valley in robotics. It's like considered like the threshold. And Mun Summ, clearly, your way of designing, WOHA's way, is to always keep human wellness at the center. This should be the platitude for architecture, but we know very well that it doesn't always happen. So how often do you check in with your inhabitants? Like, you know, one of the questions from the audience is, Skyville is now 10 years old. How's it going? And, or is it Kampong? No, it was Skyville. So how's it going and what do people tell you?
I think I think I mentioned earlier, we actually it was Nirmal's student who came from Spain and conducted some post-occupation surveys and did some interesting, sort of highlighted some interesting facts about it. And I think we have always been going back to our projects not to actually look at the physical structure, but actually to find out whether or not some of our strategy works or not. And even one of the ones that we did in Bangkok, the Met, where it's already 15 years, and we were brought back there for one of the, it was an interview for a magazine or something like that, and we arranged to talk to one of the owners of the people who were living there. And it was a very simple idea of trying to create high density, but yet not rely on air conditioning, which people in Bangkok rely a lot on. and that we were simply trying to do a building that allows people the option to open up the windows and doors. And what was really quite funny was this Thai owner said that when the project was first finished, he bought one. But after 15 years, he has acquired 15 apartments because he was so happy with the apartments that he wanted all his friends and relatives to live in it so that they could actually just have natural ventilation.
That's so nice.
So this is something I think that was a great story that we cherish.
And what did you say, 41% more friends? I mean, you had a
Yeah,
percentage that I thought was
Skyville
beautiful.
was quite interesting. In fact, we were monitoring some of the conversation going on in social media, and people were starting to identify, I belong to this Sky Village, and then they would organize events like the Midsummer Festivals together. So this was quite sort of astonishing for us, where architects are generalists and it's based on gut feeling that we go there and do the project, but to actually realize that some of this strategy work, it's really quite rewarding.
If you think about Skyville and you extrapolate that to Singapore, it's a phenomenal outcome because you take 18% less energy consumption and 30% more familiarity with neighbors.
30%. Yeah, that's amazing.
That's a good margin to aim
And
for.
I can imagine what happened during the pandemic also. Probably there was much more social life than elsewhere. Actually, we're talking about a complex of shop houses that our own Mark, we renovated and that our own Charlotte McCann lives in. And she was saying how much better it was during the pandemic to have these kind of communal spaces. So interesting. Amy, your design implications were kind of shocking, right? It makes you realize how condescending and patronizing traditional design could be, right? It makes you realize that really so much of what we think is right is indeed wrong. And instead, it reminds me of the so-called blue zones, these places in the world, including my own island of Sardinia, where I was born, and some places in Japan, where normally people live to 100 plus. And usually some of the principles are eating what you have there, but also living among generations, So when you talk to designers, do you talk to designers? Do you teach designers these principles, these counter principles?
No, really. I include designer as a part of our conversation. So they will get to talk directly with elders because I don't want to be patronizing designer either.
Well, they need a little patronizing, come on.
Yeah, but I think I strongly believe, I was involved in the designing for hospitals and nursing homes for older person, and I was pretty surprised that we rarely talk to elders themselves, but they are the experts of their old life, old age, really. So I just was very much curious about what they can tell us. So, I think, I think architects, I like architects to be a part of the conversation rather than they learn from us, learn from elders. Because just be honest, we're gonna all be older person themselves, right? So what can we learn? How can we? I feel like there is a hierarchy. So I normally ask architects not to speak up during the conversation, especially at the time of design phase, because if we just propose one or two things, and elders the community members said, okay, if the designer said that's the solution, maybe we should. But, I ask architects to not speak up, just take notes. Then people will be able to give enough information for them to be able to design.
It's interesting because it's about changing not only behaviors, but cultures. And this also leads me to speaking with Stephen about the fact that you warn us about showing us the larvae eating the burger, which is very funny because I love insects and I'm used to Neri oxman. I've been playing with Neri's silkworms, and so I find it kind of nice, right? So can you see that happen, like a hawker center that has all the hawkers there, and then there's like the big bin with the larvae, and kids are like, oh my God, look. Do you see that happen? I mean, I'm saying, I know that it sounds facetious, but I'm thinking about it seriously, right?
Yeah.
Can you see that happen? Really, our pet larvae helping us getting rid?
It's one of our main hypotheses. So we want to, I mean, I'd be very interested to know how you think about this hypothesis, but we have secured the research program for about 3 years. So we have 3 years to come back to you and answer that question. But I let you know that it is absolutely our aspiration to demonstrate how it can be possible, technically, spatially, programmatically, and maybe aesthetically. And to come back to your to your question about me warning you, I thought about it. I could just flick that slide and straight away you'd be having kind of larvae consuming a bun on screen. But I happen to believe there was some discussion this morning about waste systems, which I thought was very interesting. But a lot of the aesthetic discussions were always about contra waste. So the aesthetics was always defined in relation to form and beauty and elegance. But aesthetics is bigger than that. Aesthetics, and maybe this is what you're getting at, but aesthetics can grapple with the marginal and even the ugly. So aesthetics is a much broader category, and I think one of the aspects that we need to think about, and by the way, this is not a research question, but I'm very interested, would be in what respect do we have to change our aesthetic sort of profile as urban residents to start to become more hospitable to processes that are not elegant and inherently beautiful.
Well, Emi was talking about imperfection before, but I also think that the opposite of beautiful is not ugly, but lazy or indifferent.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
But the wabi-sabi point I completely get, and I desperately wanted to come back to that question as well.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I'm curious because I'm involved in, just more sustainable hospital operation. Just try to reduce, all this waste, because the food waste is very big in the hospital. So I was wondering if that approach is that people will probably ask questions about hygienic issues.
I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I know that black soldier flies are not inherently disease-based. It's not a disease vector. It looks like flies, it looks like excrement, and it is excrement, but it's behaving completely differently in relation to human public health. So it's quite remarkable that this, again, that's why I come back to the question of aesthetics, because there is no inherent definition of that condition. Yes, it's ugly, yes, it's a bit squeamish, but that doesn't necessarily transpose onto being a public health risk. And in fact, it is one of our research questions as to how to think about institutions like hospitals, where of course lots and lots of food is being produced and consumed.
And actually, when you were rehearsing yesterday, you also spoke about the black soldier flies being halal, and all of us were like, what do you mean? How do you make that happen, right? You also have to take that into consideration.
All I can say, it's one of our research questions.
There you go.
And let me just flesh out, as an academic, we're always interested in research questions. But the question would be, what happens if the food is not separated halal and non-halal? Does it become, in a way, do we set back the clock, biologically speaking and culturally speaking, once that's been through the kind of larvae process? In other words, does that food produce halal food in the end or not? And that's an open question. Gotcha. So it's a cultural question, a technical question, and design question.
Cultural.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So Mun Summ, one of the questions asks, could you speak to why Singapore hasn't continued to build similar sky villages?
I think that was one of the questions.
It's going to start talking. No?
I think that was one of the questions that was we were discussing earlier. Why is it some of the experiments that were done in Singapore not implemented? I think maybe it's Skyville, maybe not scaled up, but Kampong Admiralty is.
I can't give you mine.
I think Kampong Admiralty have decided to scale up, not scale up, but actually to create more of this in the other neighborhoods. I think that was politically very successful, primarily because it was about public spaces, and it was about how the community could use the spaces, and every MP said, I wanted one of them in my backyard.
Oh, really?
So that worked for
Okay.
But I think Skyview and Dawson, maybe the feedback wasn't coming back to
Thank you.
HDB or to the MPs sufficiently that they would demand to have something like that, because I think it's the topic is a little bit more removed from sort of immediate feedback.
What are the implications and how hard it is to create a health district in Singapore?
It's not easy, to be very honest. So, okay. So there is, so the NUS, NUHS, and HDB started to create a district level of intervention for really a population health level of, just bringing more well-being to the population, and also allow people to age in place and really reduce the nursing home usage. So people can actually live in the district healthy, and they will choose, we are hoping, with the technology, preventative health, built environment, to really encourage people to make healthier choices, healthier behavior choices, making decision-making process, so that the district level of health is going to be changed. So HDB, and we are working with HDB to change the environment so that people, it's simple example will be, you just increase walkability. So people walk more to maintain their health. And we are bringing technology so that people can assess their own health. And we just, so rather than just try to move into disease focus, so we're gonna go and help you to fix it. Why don't we just take a different approach to say, how can we prevent people's disease so that it's much more preventative health from a multi-level of multi-sectorial, multi-ministries kind of approach. And I actually moved from Washington, D.C. to Singapore because I was very taken by that idea of district level of making this change in Singapore. So we're talking about the density issues. Singapore has, density can be positive and negative, but I think from healthcare providers, health providing, and also aging in place perspective, it is a huge benefit. Mm-hmm. People can stay at the HDB estate because it's high density. If it's a rural area, it's very hard to deliver.
You just kind of read my mind because you talked about Washington, D.C. And as I listen to you, I keep thinking of New York, and I'm like, accepting imperfection. Yeah, right. Like wellness-based districts. I mean, I was thinking, yeah, we have something to learn here. So a question for you, Nirmal. How do you convince, we've done a lot of consulting and policymaking, how do you convince other systems, particularly corporations, of the systems that you are advocating, where the benefits are intangible and beyond profits or losses, and especially long-term, which is not in the question, but it's it's always in the back of my mind?
I think there are benefits that are financial. I've done research on regenerative projects in Asia, and many of them start off by restoring ecological systems. And that seems to be an upfront cost that has no dividends. But the long-term implication is that it raises the value of the asset, it raises the perception, the public perception of what that corporation is selling. And here I'm talking about real estate developers. So I think it's a question of the time scale against which this discussion is set. If the idea is that you're going to make money in 5 years and get out of the project, then that's a hard sell. But if you take a longer time scale, then that transforms what values you acquire from that system. And I think the holy grail of this conversation is about understanding the interchangeability of capitals. So we talk about different growth of different capitals, natural capital and social capital. There's a lot of research that's happening in this field about how human capital, for example, translates to financial capital. If you have a biophilic environment, how does that affect health in the long run, and how does that translate to national healthcare costs? If you have natural capital, for example, parks and natural spaces, how does that translate to productivity or happiness of people, the sociability of that environment? There are all these conversations taking place about the interchangeability of capitals. And once we begin to understand better the exchange rate of these capitals, we can have that conversation a little better.
It would be, it's my dream, because one of the biggest projects for challenges for design and for culture is how unmeasurable they are so far and how the metrics don't work. Combined with what Lim Seong Wan was talking about before, the fact that politicians have a certain lifespan and expiration date, and sometimes they don't look long-term unless they are also idealistic. And that's something that I find quite beautiful here. There's an idealism that allows long-term plans and long-term projects to flourish. Right? Because I wanted to ask you, Mun Summ, you were saying some of the seeds that we planted at this point, it's almost 30 years ago that WOHA was founded, are now really blossoming in great oak trees, right? So think about the role that WOHA and other architects that started with you 30 years ago have had on Singapore. What is your balance? What do you think? What did you do well? What did you instead do not so well about the experiments?
I guess actually for us in Singapore, because Singapore is land limited, the measure is always to go back to how could we do it and make the solution better without having more land take. And this is something I think now starting to become quite apparent when we scale it up to sort of neighborhood and district scale. And I think this is interesting primarily because we have always wanted to make all our buildings self-sufficient or to limit the carbon or the ecological footprint to just the size of it. And if we could make Singapore sort of self-sufficient or limited to limit the carbon footprint to just the island itself, then almost practically every if we can demonstrate then every city can do that, and that maybe the whole world doesn't need to depend on 50% of the arable land to feed human beings. And if we can start to reverse that and that to regenerate, rewild it, maybe there's a chance for the whole planet and for human species. I think this is something I think we always harbor sort of big ideas, but we were always afraid to talk about it. But I think with the climate change, we can come up now and say, yes, you know, we have bigger goals and things. And I think that's something I think architects, being generalists, but also needs to be idealistic, and that we need to tackle big problems, and that and sometimes you do need big problems to solve these planetary problems.
And it looks like your students, all of your students, are you also teaching, Emi? Yes, you're teaching too. It seems like all of your students are really taking that challenge on. They don't think small, ever, right? Do they?
They're not allowed to.
They're not allowed to. Okay, well, this is a pretty great way to end our session. You're not allowed to think small. So thank you very much. Great to speak with you. Thank you.